this is the last lecture, so I'm really very grateful to those of you who have managed to work your way through. And my objective today is to cover 4 topics without overrunning. What we're going to do, we'll talk about the title, the subject, the advertised subject, which is the economy and sporting success. We'll then summarise the lectures that have gone so far, and we'll look at particularly the relationship between public spending and economic growth. Then the question that I've had to answer most often in the lectures has been, what's the implication of independence for Scotland? And I don't feel I've answered it satisfactorily, so I'm trying to cover that ground this time. And finally, I think there's a sort of catch-all subject, which is that a lot of the lessons from my lecture are that we're going to see some developments which, for those of us in the West, are actually quite tough and put a bit of a strain on democracy. And I'm going to ask the question, can you have democracy if you don't play cricket? Now, obviously, cricket is just a metaphor in this context. And my theme is that you can't always get what you want, and you sometimes have to be prepared to settle for what's a second best. So, to quote the great words of the great Sir Michael Jagger, let me come straight on to the first part. I thought you'd like to see a picture of a successful Australian. The Australian economy has actually done pretty well in recent years as a result of the commodity boom. And at the same time, England have done better in the cricket, apart from last winter. So I wondered if there was a correlation. The first thing I did is I went into the economic theory of this. Essentially, there are 2 theories of the relationship between sporting success and economic prowess. The first is that if you've got more money to spend, you can spend more on sporting infrastructure and so on, and you win more events, particularly at the Olympics. Now, there's a whole series of papers on this. I'm not going through the quotes. They're in the sort of printed version of this. You can look through them. And they, of course, show that there is a relationship. The second theory is that sport is a route out of poverty. And in some sense, the more poverty you've got, the more successful, the more people are incentivized to do well at sport. And again, the sort of classic book on sport and the economy actually focuses on this one. Now, they obviously would have completely contradictory predictions, so the test is to see which works when you're looking at cricket. Now, as I say, with a picture of a successful Australia, they've done quite well recently. As a percentage of UK GDP, in 1998, Australia was just 25% of UK GDP. Now it's well over 50% of GDP. And it's a combination of faster growth and a rising currency, which have all gone together, as the commodity boom has made the demand for Australia's products that much higher, especially in the Far East. Now, they even overshot, but they've fallen back a bit, and that's my pet explanation for this past winter when they started to do rather better at the cricket. As for the cricket, Australia held the Ashes for the entire period from 1989 until the 2005 series, Flintoff's Ashes. But then, of course, they won them back in 06-07, which was a pretty disastrous tour. But since then, England had won 3 series in a row for the first time since the mid-50s, until, again, another disastrous winter in 2013. Now, if you look at this graph, you will note that the period when England won 3 series in a row coincided with the rather successful period for the Australian economy when the commodity boom overshot. So it does look as if the theory has a little bit to do with explaining things in the short term. Now, if you move to a longer period, at first sight it looks as though Australia and the UK GDP have pretty closely tracked each other. But actually, Australia now is a fairly wealthy economy and is well ahead of us in GDP, in purchasing power terms, GDP per capita. And actually, the Australian economy in the 1850s was an extraordinary creation. From 1850 to 1890, Australia was the richest economy in the world in GDP per capita terms. And it became the richest country in the world in GDP per capita terms as early as 1852, which is not all that many years after it first started. And did so until they had the most awful slump, which started in 1891. And like all these things, it got worse because after the slump, the banks got bust as well. And actually, it took until the beginning of the Second World War for Australian per capita income to catch up with where they had been in the 1890s, which is quite an extraordinary result. Now, what happened to the cricket? Now, I'm very sorry that this hasn't shown up hugely well, but if you look at this thing, the more shaded bits are when England holds the Ashes. And you can see on the left-hand side that while Australia was prosperous, by and large, England held the Ashes. Now, the bits are in the 1910s when England held the Ashes was a bit of a fluke. England won the Ashes in 1911-12, and then they played no cricket for 8 years. And so they held the Ashes because no cricket was being played, not because they were winning. But if you exclude that, what you can see is the succeeding period. Australia has held the Ashes for most of the time. In fact, since 1920, there have only been 28 years when England has held the Ashes. So that's essentially the story of cricket, that Australia dominated the Ashes series for the first half of the 1920s. Then England won 2 series in the second half of the 1920s. But then Bradman started, and Australia was in quite serious depression at that point. And Bradman very much coincided with the disastrous impacts of the depression on the Australian economy, and very much acted as one of the very few cheerful points in Australia over that period. England won only one Ashes series between 1930 and 1953, and that was the infamous Bodyline series. And as I say, living standards in Australia in the late 1930s were no higher than in the early 1890s. So while the living standards were depressed, their cricket was spectacularly good. Post-war, the relationship between the Ashes and the economy has been less closely linked. Basically, Australia won whether they'd been rich or poor for a lot of the period. But it's only recently that this link has reintroduced itself. Now, that, of course, is a very impressionistic story. What we've actually done is we've done some econometrics on this. And because my econometrics is pretty rusty and the techniques are about 50 years out of date, I asked my CBR colleague, Chris Evans, who's one of our bright young things, to do all the hard work here. So thank you very much, Chris. And what I'm going to show you are Chris's results. And if you have technical questions, I'm sure Chris will answer them. I certainly won't, that I can guarantee. This, by the way, all these slides will be on the internet, so if you can't read them, and some of them are a little bit difficult to read, don't worry too much about it. This just shows the correlation matrices between unemployment ratio, UK to Australia, GDP ratio, England to Australia, and who's hosting the Ashes series. And it shows the results that you might expect, which is, or when unemployment is higher in England, England are more likely to win the Ashes. When GDP ratio, there's a negative link between the GDP ratio and holding the Ashes, which again is in line with my sort of theory. And also, there is a 25% greater chance if you're hosting that you might be winning the Ashes, which again seems about consistent. Still doesn't make England more likely to win the Ashes, actually, because 25% improvement on a 28% chance, and it's 25% of 28%. It still doesn't actually make England more than 50% likely to win the Ashes. So that's an interesting technical point. Now, if you turn this, and really don't bother about all these detailed numbers, into a regression, I'm just printing it to show it's been done, what that shows is with these variables that, as a regression, again, they have the right sign. However, what it shows is that the GDP term and the hosting term are not statistically significant. And so dropping them and establishing a relationship between unemployment and the ashes, you get this relationship, which roughly says that if the unemployment rate in the UK goes up by 1 percentage point, and that in Australia stays the same, then England have a 10% better chance of winning the Ashes. That's what comes out. Now, we've actually drawn attention to this before. Again, don't read the small print. It's not meant, I just meant to show that we've done that. And it's got picked up in the press before. Who said that Australian crocodile Dundees are trading in the outback for the office, leading to increasing economic might but declining standards in sports, etc. Well, you must believe it, it's in the Telegraph. My sort of pet theory is that actually this move from the outback to the office is actually rather important in all this story. As Australia becomes more dominated by urban activities, and they tend to be positively correlated with GDP, it loses a little bit of the toughness that makes Australian sportsmen so formidable. You only have to visit rural Australia to realise it's a pretty tough place. And unless you're tough, you wouldn't survive. And you don't just have to be tough, but you have to be able to get on with your neighbours. Because if the water runs out, you had to get some for your mates. And that creates a sort of combination of sort of team support and mental toughness, which I think does characterise the best Australian sporting teams. By comparison, urban Australia is a more sort of nannying sort of place. I mean, when I went there for a test series, I discovered that you were not allowed to serve anything other than watered-down beer within walking distance, not just within the ground, the cricket grounds, but even within walking distance of the grounds, which seems a bit extreme, a bit harsh. And we were sitting at the Gabba, and about 2 rows away, someone who'd clearly sneaked in some gin and tonic started pouring it and got caught on the closed-circuit TV. And a SWAT squad of 30 police persons came in and assaulted them and removed them and so on. I mean, just sort of very heavy-handed and sort of suggests a sort of an attitude to health and safety, which is, well, interesting. Anyway, my sort of pet theory is that as Australia urbanises, they lose some of that mental toughness, and that urbanisation is partly to do with the successful economy. Now, the good news for England cricket is we actually think that the continuation of globalisation will help the Australian economy do better, and we see Australian GDP catching up with UK GDP, maybe not in the next decade, but probably in the one after that. So that should be good news for England's cricketers. Now, let me come into some of the things that we've been saying, the lectures and what they all mean. We've been building up a story, really, which is that globalisation is great for the world, but is tough for us. It makes the world a much tougher place for us. It makes the world a much tougher place for Westerners who, by and large, have been used to quite high living standards compared with people in the rest of the world. Even poor people in developed countries have had high living standards compared with those in the middle in developing countries up until now. The first lecture pointed out the pace of economic development in the Far East and pointed out because it's so rapid that attitudes change much more slowly. And that's really the key thesis underpinning this, which is that whereas when we developed relatively slowly, and we took some of our gains in setting up a welfare state to cushion the rough edges of economic life, we decided to work less hard, we took longer holidays, etc. In the Far East, they haven't done that. Singapore and Hong Kong have a higher level of GDP per capita than we have. Neither of them have a welfare state. And they both work incredibly long hours. They work 5 months more a year. And despite that, they live longer as well. So, God, it's a sense a scary place because we've got to compete with people who are sort of doing things in a slightly different way. Now, the second lecture pointed out that the economic environmental consequences of most of the world trying to live in the way that previously only 10% lived, would mean a shift in the terms of trade towards commodities, particularly pointed to the potential long-term shortage of minerals, which of course is good news for the Australian economy. The pressure on the supply of natural resources means that we will have to generate higher commodity and energy prices than before, even if the price of oil itself falls back a bit from where it's been recently. The third lecture reinvented Keynesianism for the 21st century by bringing in the concept that you also needed to sort out the balance of payments, which Keynes really didn't get his mind around. And for a lot of time, that's not been hugely relevant. But now with super competitive economies and a terms of trade loss from much more expensive minerals and things, it is an issue. We also picked this up in some of the other lectures, which we looked at the need to bring in money GDP targets as a way of controlling the economy and bringing a bit more flexibility into the economy in a new and different world. And also the need to raise the ratio, change the structure of GDP. So consumer spending drops from 70% where it is today to about 50% of GDP, while exports rise from 30% to about 60% of GDP. Will become over time a much more export-led economy. I then looked at how to make Western economies more competitive. And in particular, I looked at one thing, which is in the past, we tried to compensate people who were relatively poor by paying them extra, giving them supplements, giving them income support credits, tax credits and things like that, and also through giving them benefits. Now, it suggested a different way, which was instead to look at where our costs are high and bring down the cost of living, which of course is going to be important not just for poor people, but for everyone, as wages get squeezed by competition with the other economies in the world, and the prices of some goods are going to have to go up because of more expensive raw materials. So getting down the cost of housing, taking the unnecessary elements out of energy costs, and taking down levels of taxation, the surcharge of VAT on everything you buy at 20%, for example, bringing these down is a sort of secret weapon that you can use in the war against the high cost of living, and potentially has a ratchet effect, because the lower the cost of living, the less pressure there is for higher public spending on quite a lot of services. We also looked at the Chinese savings glut and pointed out that long-term interest rates are likely to be low for probably a generation, because the Chinese savings glut is on such a scale that even as it falls back, it will add to the world savings ratio, which has already gone up from 23% to 27% and looks likely to rise further. Now, what that means is if long-term interest rates are low, asset values are likely to be high. So things like shares, classic cars, art, the prices are likely to remain high, unlike the article in this week's Spectator. The sixth lecture identified those economies likely to win and those likely to lose. Now, there's some overlap between that lecture and the lecture on, or between the latter category in that lecture and the lecture on the euro, because of the 27 countries that have had slow growth in the current century, half of them are European. So, but we did also look at the euro specifically, and I pointed out actually the euro is not the cause of the major European economic problems. That's Europe's lack of competitiveness. The euro has exacerbated the difficulties, but it has not been the cause of the difficulties. And that's an important distinction to make. The eighth lecture was probably the hardest lecture. This is the lecture that I gave last September. And this lecture tried to deal with the whole issue of the impact of globalization on two different things. One was inequality, and the other was poverty. And it showed it had widened inequality fairly dramatically. But it also showed that it had also had dramatic effects in reducing poverty. Using the target of the Millennium Goals, they've been double overachieved. The aim was to reduce poverty, world poverty in 15 years by 50%. The result has been to reduce world poverty by 75%. And by the way, hardly any of that is through charity or through aid. It's economic growth that has done it. It's the capitalist system, which the so-called rock star economist Thomas Piketty so much attacks, that has actually improved the living standard of the poorest people, and incidentally him as well. And I think I would happily put up with inequality if I know that poor people are going to be less poor, are going to be starving less. I think that's the trade-off you really have to make. Whether if you're anti-capitalist, you may like to indulge yourself by opposing capitalism, but the price will be paid by poor people, not by rich people, on the whole. So that's probably the most interesting of the lectures. I also managed to prove that Karl Marx was nearly right, that global capitalism meant exploiting the workers, but the problem in Britain is we didn't exploit them enough. And certainly with the tube strikers on strike today, the sooner we have driverless trains, the better. But one of the key themes has been that the UK economy has been getting relatively small. And as the UK economy has been getting relatively small compared to the rest of the world, we have to compare ourselves with Asia, and we have to see what is happening over there. And the Asian economy is rising from 1998, 14% of the world economy to about 30% of the world economy. At the same time, the European economy gets distinctly smaller. So when we're looking at sort of targets for ourselves, we shouldn't just compare ourselves with our European neighbours. We need to take a much more holistic approach. Now, this rather interesting chart is something called the Scully curve. The whole relationship between public spending and economic growth was opened up by the economist Robert Barrow, who, by showing pretty conclusively that public spending, the higher public spending led to lower economic growth, that probably cost him a Nobel Prize, because the people who issue the Nobel Prizes don't tend to go for people who produce such a politically incorrect result. I think he should be proud of the fact he hasn't got a Nobel Prize, because that proves he's kept his integrity. The work has been also supported by a gentleman called Gerald Scully, who is no longer with us, I'm afraid. And what this chart shows is the estimate of the relationship between government expenditure and GDP that's been estimated by the Fraser Institute in Canada, who are a bit like the Institute for Economic Affairs in the UK, except they're based in Canada. Now, what this says, bear with me, is that there's a quadratic relationship between economic growth and public spending as a share of the economy. Economic growth varies positively with the share of public spending, but negatively with the square of the share of public spending. That is mathematically complicated, but what it does show is a curve of the kind you can see up there. On the left-hand side of the chart, what that says is, initially, as public spending goes up, it supports growth because it provides the key infrastructure, it provides the rule of law, that kind of thing, which is actually essential to create economic growth. There's a sweet spot, 25 to 30% of GDP. After that, public spending starts to be a drag on economic growth. And if you go beyond that, you find that the higher you have public spending, the slower the rate of growth. Now, the successful economies in the world, in Asia, have public spending shares of GDP of roughly half ours. And that is a challenge for us. It's quite interesting, though, just to see where they spend the money. And we've particularly looked at Singapore because there's very good detail on the Singapore budget. And first of all, you have to correct the figures. Singapore, in theory, spends 16.7%, when on equivalent figures we spend 46.7%. Actually, that's not quite fair, because the Singaporeans off budget have compulsory Central Provident Fund contributions, which are 7.3% of GDP. They have private additional payments for health, which are 3.6% of GDP. That's covered by us through the NHS. So if you want to compare like for like and get something closer to apples and apples, it's more like comparing 27.6% with 46.7%. But still, it means that they spend a lot less than we do. But what is actually fascinating is you go down the list, you can see that actually on the things they want to spend, they spend a lot more. Defence as a share of GDP, they spend twice as much as we do. Education, they spend about 25% more. Housing, they spend 5 times as much as we do. Transport, they spend 5 times as much as we do. And they've got top state-of-the-art transport infrastructure. Anyone who's ever been to Singapore will know. Of course, they save on things. They haven't had past debt, so they don't have to pay debt interest. But they seem to do pretty well in actually on the things that they think are really important, spending a lot of money to produce rather high-quality public services. Where they save are in two areas. Health, where they don't have a health system, and actually seem to get away with spending relatively little on health. It's not just because the population is young, but also the population only spends on the health it actually needs. And secondly, they have no welfare state, as I mentioned before. And as you can see, not having a welfare state saves them spending of over 15% of GDP. That's what they save their money on. Now, no one else has actually looked at this before, made this comparison. I think it is quite instructive. We can't obviously copy them completely, but I think we still should be aware of what they do in order to inform the decisions that we make ourselves. We have some other issues in the UK, which is as public spending has got up to 45% of GDP. Productivity hasn't been great. It's actually fallen up until very recently. And quite a gap has arisen, even if you take 97 as a base. And I don't actually think in 1997 that public sector productivity was as high as in the private sector. And since then, the situation has got distinctly worse. My sort of impressionistic view is you spend £5 in the public sector, you get about £1 of value. So I do think that there is a productivity issue there. Right, having dealt with public spending like that, let me turn to Scottish independence. Now, I would assume that Alex Salmond's hit squad, as they come and try and disrupt the meeting, will come in round about now. So keep your eyes open. I've been asked more questions about Scottish independence in recent years than any other subject except the euro. And I think just about every second lecture there's been a question. I don't feel I've dealt with them satisfactorily. So what I'd like to do is try to deal with them this time. Here's a picture of their great leader, the Scottish version of Robert Mugabe. As a Scot who's intensely proud to be British, I'm amazed that my fellow countrymen have any desire to be independent. Certainly the examples of the two areas where Scotland already has independence, which are the Scottish football team and the Scottish rugby team, are not encouraging, to put it mildly. Though the Scottish football team have bounced back in world rankings to number 22, their typical ranking is about 40, and they have dropped as low as 86 in recent years. The Scottish rugby team is the 10th ranked in the world, comfortably behind any of the other home nations. They're below Samoa, but just above Fiji and Tonga. But I think on the issue of Scottish independence, it's Tony Blair who sold the past. I'm sure he hoped that Scottish Home Rule would be a destination in itself. But anyone with a working knowledge of history could see that this would only work while the same party controlled both the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster Parliament. And you really couldn't rely on that existing forever. Now, as someone with a family home in Scotland who visits regularly, it's hard not to notice that the Scottish media behaves as if Scotland were independent already. Pretty well all the attention is to what's happening in Scotland. There's remarkably little coverage of the rest of the UK in the Scottish media today. And I think that is a change that has happened since devolution. But I think there is actually a historic separation between Scotland and England. There's remarkably little population north of Newcastle going up to Edinburgh. My parents have a house in East Lothian, and I've walked 20 miles south without seeing any human habitation at all. There's a big sort of wasteland in between. Of course, if you walk 20 miles south, there's no mobile phone signal either, which is normally the proof of underpopulation, because where there's population, the telephone companies make sure there's a mast. Scotland has had a tradition of collectivist culture. And actually, for most of the past 400 years, this worked very well. And right up to the 1960s, someone who had attained a number of hires in the school exams in Scotland could expect to be rather better educated than someone with a degree from one of the lesser English universities. And that was even before they suddenly called all the polytechnics universities and started issuing degrees in media studies and the like, let alone pop theory and that kind of stuff. The Scottish education system was the envy of the world and contributed to the Scots' genius for invention that prepared the way for so much of the modern world. I'd like to make 3 propositions. First, whether we like it or not, Scottish independence looks very likely. I think the only circumstance in which I would see it not happening at all is if there was a very large no majority on the 18th of September this year. In many ways, a small no vote is the worst of all worlds because it keeps the ball in play. And uncertainty is the thing that really is economically damaging. A small no vote would mean, unless the SNP lost power, that they would keep holding referenda until they either got a yes or the no vote climbed. And I think the momentum would tend to be with them. My second proposition is that the initial economic costs are probably a lot higher than most people imagine. Scotland actually pays its own way as far as the budget deficit is concerned, although they'd have to have a slightly tighter one, being a small economy if they were independent. Scotland's got 2 things. It's got North Sea oil, but it's also got, and this is a tragic thing to say, and you shouldn't say it and make too much of a joke about it, but it is paradoxical. Because life expectancy in parts of Scotland is so low, they make a huge saving on their pension bill and on their social security costs. And that was the big hole in Gordon Brown's argument last week. That's why his numbers actually were completely wrong. That is a benefit to the Scottish economy in fiscal terms, nearly as big as that of North Sea oil, surprisingly. But it is paradoxical, and I wouldn't want to make too much of a joke about it. Now, there are some industries in Scotland that would be boosted by independence. I think tourism probably would be. But the one that I think is particularly at risk is financial services. Financial services are and particularly banks, do actually have to be regulated within the same area as their customers. And I think the banking crises that we've seen now make it pretty clear that that has to be the case. And the weaknesses of the euro mean that I cannot see any chance of either an economic union or a banking union with an independent country. It just won't happen. And Whitehall is scarred by this. So this is the collective wisdom of Whitehall is so totally again that whatever anyone says, it just won't happen. But without a banking union, I think that probably between 20 and 40,000 jobs, and it's obviously difficult to be precise about this, are potentially at risk, as banks particularly, but quite a lot of the other fund management firms, except those who are specialists, move jobs to London, and particularly to the City of London. My third proposition is that many Scots seem to think that they're voting not so much for independence but from the rest of the UK, but for independence from the laws of economics, which they seem to think have been imposed upon them by the English. Now, unfortunately for those who think this, the laws of economics are not actually subject to referenda and will continue to exist beyond Scottish independence if and when it occurs. And my sort of suspicion is that an independent Scotland may learn about economics the hard way. There could well be an initial slump as you get the knock-on effect, first of all from some fiscal adjustments, secondly from the cost of having to pay for all the parties and all the embassies and all the other things that presidents and things like to have, or new leaders like to have. Basically, these people are slightly trumped-up town councillors who are going to be on a spending spree and given a country. So they will be living it up a bit initially. Also, the rest of the UK has been treated pretty roughly by the pro-independence campaign, and I suspect will be in no mood to be especially generous in the divorce settlement. Post-independence, there might be also an initial period of tax and spend with its normal negative implications for economic growth. But that's the initial effect. I do think they'd learn, and I think at some point there would be a growth spurt. It took Ireland 40 years to get its economy right after independence. I don't think it would take as long in Scotland. It cost Ireland, my rough guess, is about 30% of GDP, while they pursued slightly muddled economic policies as a result of independence. Again, I don't think it would cost as much in Scotland. I think it might only be 10% or so. But still, that's a cost. However, if you're in favour of Scottish independence, then I guess you'd be prepared to spend 10p in the pound to get it. Economics is not the only thing in life. and you have to balance economic considerations with other considerations. Now, I have a final point, which I haven't really got time to labour properly, so I'll just leave it as an observation. Scottish independence will affect the rest of us in the UK much more than we imagine. There's no doubt Scotland is a viable economy independently, but I don't think Wales is. Scotland and Wales both got Home Rule at the same time. I think the Welsh are going to be left incredibly lonely if Scotland gets independence. And I really see no prospect of Welsh independence. I don't think Wales could survive economically with independence. The scale of subsidy from the rest of the UK to Wales is pretty massive. England will also look different. The extent to which the north of England is dominated by the affluent south will get much greater. And without Scotland, the rest of the country will probably move to the right politically, which some people may think is a good thing, although others may not. At the same time, we should remember that the rest of the UK, and hopefully someone will think of a better name, by the way, has a GDP that will still be 92% of the GDP, including Scotland. And even without Scotland, the rest of the country's GDP will overtake France by about 2016, and would probably overtake Germany by about 2040 if the euro remains weak. So, I mean, yes, the rest would be affected, but actually most of it does remain and will have quite an incentive for economic prosperity. Now, my last subject is, can you have democracy if you don't play cricket? I'll be a bit self-indulgent here. I'll give you my holiday snaps. Last year, Anthony and I drove 7,000 miles around the United States in our ancient car. And because we drove a silly car, we actually got to meet and talk to quite a lot of people. And the thing that really struck us was that there's been a huge growth in political partisanship in the United States. And I was actually struck by one of our really quite close friends who we stayed with, who did say that he was not at all upset by President Obama using the income tax system to harass his opponents because his opponents were bad people. And I thought, when you reach that point where you abuse the organs of the state to harass people, that is quite serious. And liberal-minded people are starting to think that that's acceptable behaviour. You've got some real problems in having a sort of a sufficient community understanding to make democracy worse. The Scots don't play cricket, and that may well explain Gordon Brown, who is, I'm sure, the most intensely partisan figure in politics that we've had for many years. Now, I think the greatest of all cricket writers, a man called Sir Neville Cardus, he wrote, it's a sort of similar thinking to mine. If everything else in this nation of ours was lost but cricket, her constitution and the laws of England of Lord Halsbury, it would still be possible to construct from the theory and practice of cricket all the eternal Englishness that has gone into the establishment of that constitution and the laws aforesaid. In other words, the constitution is not hugely important. All you need is the cricket. Now, that's the greatest of all cricket writers. I mean, much greater than me. And I think it's true. Now, those who play cricket with me will know that most cricket at club level is played with lousy umpires. Actually, the problem's even worse in rugby, where the lousy refereeing extends to international level. But international cricket's a bit different. They have introduced decision review with using technology. And the thing that's amazed everyone is more than 90% of the umpire's decisions at test level are right, which, if you think about it, is a pretty extraordinary thing, given the tough judgments you have to make. But rugby, that's not the case. It's more like 90% wrong. No, not quite that, but that's the sort of impression you get. But at club level, the umpires are not very good. And but it's driven into, at a very early age, that you cannot play cricket if you argue or attempt to argue with the umpire. Their decisions have to be taken as final. If you think the umpire's making a mistake, it's a mark of honour, not even to indicate that you think this. Even if you're a batsman whose entire day has been spoilt by a bad umpiring mistake to your first ball, where he's given you out and you just have to disappear off. And it's also bad for us bowlers. But, I mean, batsmen suffer really quite badly from umpiring mistakes if they go in the wrong direction. And they still are meant to behave themselves. Even if they've given up a day to play cricket, they get one ball and that's it. But it's an excellent training for life. It proves that life is unfair. And you have, to some extent, to accept that. You have to learn respect for your opponents. You have to learn respect for the people who make the rules and arbitrate the rules, even if you know that they're incompetent. Now, the relevance of all this to my Gresham lecture series is that what we are seeing as a result of globalization is quite a lot of things that are going to be quite tough to take. Particularly for those of us in the West who've been used to having it pretty good for generations. Inequality is on the increase and is going to continue. The shift from incomes to profits, household incomes to profits, is on the increase and is going to continue. As I say, we're probably going to have more exploitation, not less. And on the whole, by the way, that's quite good for economic growth. Consumer spending will grow less than GDP. The public isn't going to like this. And in the sort of modern age where politicians have become really very good at studying the electoral mood and trying to give them what they want, I think the politicians are going to react to this in a bit like the sort of parents who always give in to their children and feed them sweets and McDonald's. And that is my fear. Now, we can be more successful if we can encourage the public to have a view that they can't always get what they want. Now, Mick Jagger shows very good taste in his cars, even not necessarily in absolutely everything else that he does. But I think that his message is one that we have to try and get across to people, that you have to have respect, you have to accept some of the things that happen, even if you appreciate they're unfair. Remember, it's the same global capitalism that is generating the inequality that has also done so much to reduce poverty around the world. I think you have to be prepared sometimes to accept things are not quite what you want. And I think in politics, they're going to have to learn, in a sense, not to give the electorate so many sweets and so many McDonald's. The electorate have got to learn to be content with the government not always giving them the easy thing, but being more prepared to support an economic system that, by and large, is doing quite a lot of good for the world. So that's the gist of what I've got to say. I'm not going to review the conclusions. You can read them. They'll be on the website, and you've heard them once already, and I've overrun my time. Can I just say again, thank you very much to everyone who has made the effort to turn up. I really appreciate the support that you've given me through this lecture series. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope it stimulates you to stay interested in economics. Thank you very much indeed.